My friends and family know that I have long had a deep and abiding interest in royalty, in the history of kings and queens. I have made an intense study of Britain's conception of coronation, and I have read books about the houses of Tudor, Stuart, Hanover, Saxe-Coburg, Gotha, and Windsor. I have read much of Churchill's History of the English-Speaking Peoples, and I have also watched the greatest plays and films about kings: Becket, A Man for All Seasons, Henry V, The King's Speech, The King and I, and The Lion King. But perhaps my favorite story regarding royalty centers on Yehuda Avner, who grew up as a young man in England, made Aliyah, fought in Israel's War of Independence, and ultimately returned to the United Kingdom as Menachem Begin's Israeli ambassador to the court of St. James. In his own memoir, Avner recounts his first meeting with the Queen, and he writes, "Escorted into the Queen's chamber by a chamberlain dressed like the Duke of Wellington, I executed the rehearsed choreography with due aplomb, bowing at the door, walking 2 steps forward, bowing again, 2 more steps forward, bowing once more and proclaiming, 'Your Majesty, I have the honor to present to you my credentials as the ambassador of Israel to the court of St. James.' 'Thank you,' said the Queen, taking the embossed document in her white-gloved hand and passing it to her chamberlain. Then, writes Avner, in a voice that sounded mystified, the Queen said, 'I do believe that this is the very first time I have ever received credentials from a foreign ambassador who was actually born in this country. How did you manage that?' Writes Avner, anticipating the question, I had rehearsed a rather high-minded response. 'Your Majesty,' said I, 'though physically born in this country, I was spiritually given birth to in Jerusalem, from whence my ancestors were exiled by Roman legions 2,000 years ago.' And the Queen says, 'Were they really? How unfortunate.' And she began to talk about the weather. Writes Avner, droplets of sweat trickled down my armpits. Here was I alluding to the mysteries of Jewish history's conundrums. And there was she talking about the weather. It is a striking story because in it we see a royal representative of a monarchy whose entire purpose is to embody history, who nevertheless perhaps found the timeless nature of Jewish existence too mysterious to grasp. It is, as we say, in one of the Rosh Hashanah Piyutim, one of the High Holy Day prayers, Melech Evion, a king, a monarch, a dynasty of flesh and blood, Bala Varad Shachat, that cannot endure. It is mortal. Aval Melech Elyon, but the heavenly king, and by implication, the people that through the generations have proclaimed this heavenly being as king, Ladei Ad Yimloch, he will reign eternally, and the people who serve him will be eternal as well. It is that mystery, that miracle, that I hope to ponder today in our introduction to Rosh Hashanah. No Jewish holiday contains more diverse aspects and ideas than the day known as Rosh Hashanah. And drawing all of them together in one short lecture risks failing to do proper justice to any of them. Woody Allen has a famous line where he says, "I took a speed reading course, and then I read Tolstoy's War and Peace in 10 minutes. It's about Russia." The danger of attempting to summarize Rosh Hashanah in a short talk is that we actually present a superficial understanding of the day. I will, however, attempt it nevertheless, seeking to highlight some of the central aspects of the holiday. 3 themes of Rosh Hashanah, each of which build upon the other, each finding expression in the liturgy of the day, and each in its own way made manifest in the ancient instrument known as the shofar, the animal horn, whose sound summons for most Jews the mood and the spirit of the high holidays. We will emerge, hopefully, with a more thorough understanding not only of the holiday, but of the secret of Jewish eternity itself. We begin by noting that the most common statement made about this holiday, one which I habitually make as well, is actually incorrect. Rosh Hashanah is known as the Jewish New Year. In fact, rightly understood, the Jewish calendar marks two separate New Years, and Rosh Hashanah is not the Jewish New Year. With Passover in the spring, we mark the yearly commemoration of the Exodus and the birth of the Jewish people, and that month is actually the beginning of the Jewish New Year. 6 months after that, on Rosh Hashanah, we commemorate the creation of the universe, saying in the liturgy over and over, Hayom Harat Olam, today is the birthday of the world. And it is therefore on this day every year that the world stands in judgment. This is not the Jewish New Year. It is the world's New Year. Or as I often put it, Rosh Hashanah is not the Jewish New Year, it's the world's New Year, just only Jews know that. The first theme of Rosh Hashanah is thus not particularistic, but universal in nature. It is the day on which we recognize God as creator and therefore ruler of the universe. And it is therefore the day on which we coronate him as king of all creation. Again and again, the Almighty is proclaimed Melech al kol haaretz, king over all the earth. Again and again, we emphasize the Almighty's absolute power. We are emphasizing throughout as well God's monarchy and his majesty, and our frailty, fallibility, and mortality. And it is to emphasize the kingship of God that the shofar is, in the Bible, introduced. Yom Teruah yeh lachem, a sound of the shofar blast, a day of the shofar blast, of the Teruah. This day shall be for you. The word shofar in the Bible is also commonly mistranslated as ram's horn. The shofar, however, does not mean ram's horn. It refers to a variety of different animal horns. Indeed, it is quite clear that as late as the Mishnaic age, all sorts of animal horns were sounded, with the emphasis on the ram's horn only coming later, as we shall soon discuss. In fact, I happen to have a wide-ranging and diverse shofar collection, perhaps the largest exotic shofar collection in North America. I bought all of them in South Africa, and then when I was transferring at security in London for a flight to the US, the entire suitcase was unpacked. And what lay before these security guards were shofar of an eland and an oryx and a variety of other magnificent animals. And they looked at me, thinking that I was some sort of animal smuggler, and said to me, "What are these?" And I said with every confidence, "These are shofars. They're important horns for my religion." And they looked at me and said, "What religion is this?" But the truth is, they are rooted in our religion. And all of these horns are rooted in antiquity. They are, rightly understood, nothing less than the original coronation trumpets of the biblical age. And this can be seen from a variety of biblical sources, including a story in Tanakh that has inspired another country's approach to coronation as well. For over 1,000 years, the crowning of an English king or queen has featured a reference to the anointing of King Solomon. In 1953, made famous in an episode of the Netflix show The Crown, the Archbishop of Canterbury said as he anointed Elizabeth II, quote, "As Solomon was anointed by Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet, so be thou anointed, blessed, and consecrated queen over the peoples whom the Lord thy God hath given thee to govern." Handel, for George II, composed a coronation hymn whose words cite scripture. Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet anointed Solomon king, and all the people rejoiced and said, "Long live the king." And this too, since its composition, has been sung at the coronation of every British monarch. And yet, in Westminster Abbey, at these coronations, the most important ingredient is missing. And I quote from the Book of Kings, "And Zadok the priest took the horn of oil out of the tent and anointed Solomon. And they blew the shofar, and all the people said, 'Long live King Solomon.'" One can just see this in Westminster Abbey, the Archbishop saying, "Tekiah," and then sounding it. But it would be appropriate because it is the shofar, not Handel's coronation chorus, that mark the ascension of a biblical king. And if we sound it on Rosh Hashanah, it is because the shofar is meant to evoke the majesty of God as king, creator, and providential overseer of the universe. The Rosh Hashanah liturgy stresses that the shofar was sounded upon the Almighty Monarch's entry into history in the revelation at Sinai. And all the nations saw the voices and the lightning and the mount of fire and the call of the shofar growing ever stronger. And, as we further emphasize in our holiday prayers, the shofar evokes as well the ultimate redemption of the world by the ruler of the universe, reminding us not only of what was, but also of what is yet to be. V'haya bayom hahu yitaka b'shofar gadol. And it will be on that day, God will blow a great shofar, and all whom He created will finally realize His rulership and their absolute dependence on Him. The shofar is thus itself an embodiment of the kingship of God. For Ashkenazic tradition, the liturgical linking of shofar and majesty achieves its apotheosis in Unetana Tokef, where a great shofar is sounded, all humanity is summoned before the divine judge and king, and their future is decided, who will live and who will die. This is our first theme. God is the universe's creator and its king. And the theme is ubiquitous in the Rosh Hashanah prayers morning and afternoon. And yet, in between these prayers, the Torah scroll is taken out of the ark, escorted to the center of the synagogue, and selections are read on day 1 and day 2, each followed by its own prophetic portion, or haftarah. And it is here that our second theme emerges. If you were in charge of Judaism, if you were writing the rules, if you were designing the sacred service of this most awesome of days, what would you choose as the scriptural readings for Rosh Hashanah? What biblical text would best reflect the fearful themes that have been so exquisitely invoked in the liturgy? Surely our Torah reading should be Breshit, the Genesis account. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. A similar scriptural reading could be chosen for the Haftarah. Perhaps Isaiah 45, with its declaration, "It is I who made the earth and created mankind upon it." The scriptural text should parallel the prayers. The themes should coincide. And yet, as Rabbi Jonathan Sacks once put it, any one of these scriptural choices would be logical, but every one of them would be wrong. The odd thing is that instead, on this day of days, rather than focusing on creation, all of our readings are about parents and children, fathers and mothers. On the first day, the scriptural selection from the Pentateuch is the miraculous birth of Isaac, the child that is born to a woman 90 years of age and to a man who is a centenarian. The parallel prophetic passage is the story of Hannah, the tale of a woman who wants nothing other than a child, and one that ultimately is given to her, which she names Shmuel, Samuel. We read, in other words, not of God's creation and kingship, but of family. And though the sound of the shofar was first understood as a manifestation of God's majesty and His mastery over history, over time it came to be interpreted as well as a human cry, that perhaps of a mother for a child, or perhaps even more interestingly, as the cry of a baby at the moment of its birth, before it has yet to learn any linguistic skills at all. I saw in one interesting book on language that researchers have noted that at around 9 months of age, babies start to give their babbling a bit of a beat, reflecting the rhythm of the language they're learning, so that by that point the utterances of English babies sound different from French babies, and both are utterly different from Chinese children. It is only babies' early cries that are utterly unimpacted by language. Scientists have recorded cries from babies in different parts of the world. They have mixed the recordings up, and then they've asked listeners to sort them out. That cannot be done. And it is thus, according to this understanding, on Rosh Hashanah, the birthday of the world, that through the shofar we emit a cry like a languageless newborn child. Understood this way, the shofar represents not only the coronation of God, but something that would seem to be the exact opposite, the miraculous moment that is the birth of a helpless, mewling, newborn baby. How can these two themes be reconciled? What is the possible connection between the prayers and the readings, between the cosmic and the personal, the cosmological and the familial, between God as King and Creator, Judge and Redeemer, and us as parents and children? The answer lies in a startling, revolutionary notion that Judaism introduces of God's creation. If we cherish this relationship between parents and children, it is because we believe that this love most imitates divine love. It was at the bris, the circumcision of our 5th child, that my wife spoke of a mystery pondered by Jewish mystics, how God, who is infinite and all-inclusive, can still make room for creation. The mystics called this in Hebrew tzimtzum, which is a sacrifice of God's all-inclusiveness, a retreat into transcendence in order to allow a world to emerge outside the divine. At the circumcision, my wife cited the great Talmudist and philosopher Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, who built on this notion by describing creation as sacrificial divine action. God, he said, retreated and left a void for the universe to fill. He made room for the universe, creating a world in order to care, sustain, and love. Similarly, Rabbi Soloveitchik said, man and woman in becoming parents withdraw from self-centered romanticism into a love-oriented community. And my wife, quoting this, concluded her own remarks by saying that in making room for our children, our lives have become more crowded, but our lives are also grown more capacious, our internal resources richer and more vast. And she concluded, I thank the Master of the universe for the small but wonderful universe that he has helped us to fashion in our own home. And what this means is that God brought the universe into being, but granted us as well the ability to create a universe through families of our own. God created us in his image, which means for Rabbi Soloveitchik that we too are bequeathed a creative capacity. It was a Jewish woman who once remarked that now that I'm a parent, I know what it's like to be God, because now I know what it's like to create someone that you can't control. It is a funny statement, but also a profoundly true one. If Rosh Hashanah is a remembrance of the time that the universe was born, the most powerful way of reminding ourselves of that miracle is to think about the only other similar miracle that we know of, which is the birth of a child. Rabbi Sachs, in making this point, notes that I was once tempted to write to the physicist Stephen Hawking after reading his book, A Brief History of Time. Hawking wrote that a unified field theory, if discovered, would explain the structure of the universe. If we knew that, he said, we would know the mind of God. I wanted to tell him that from a Jewish perspective, you don't need theoretical physics to come as close as we can to the mind of God. All we need to know is what it is to be a parent. And when we consider that, we realize that these two themes, the kingship of God and human beings becoming parents, these two themes actually enhance each other. God is our king because he is our creator. And we seek on Rosh Hashanah to emphasize this fact. And yet, all the liturgical descriptions in the world, all the verbal exclamations, and all the metaphors at our linguistic disposal cannot bring us to any comprehension of creation. After all, as the Almighty informs Job out of the whirlwind, were you there when I laid the foundations of all the earth? Creation, no matter how vividly described, cannot be imagined. The cosmic liturgy is therefore joined with descriptions of family. And we read not the first chapter of Genesis, but rather about our families, first fathers and mothers, and we thereby better comprehend creation itself. There's an old joke about a 5-year-old child in a religious school who is busily drawing on a piece of paper. And the teacher asks, "What are you doing?" And the child says, "I'm drawing a picture of God." And the teacher says, "Nobody knows what God looks like." And the child, with every confidence, replies, "Well, they will in 5 minutes." For the Hebrew Bible, even if we cannot see God, when father and mother together produce a child, love a child, raise a child, we can indeed see what God's love looks like. And it is pondering our love for our children and understanding that this creative instinct derives from one belonging to God that we can best comprehend creation when we ourselves move from self-centered romanticism to a love-oriented community, when we too create a universe, however small, of our own. Thus, these two themes, creation and kingship, and human parenthood, rather than contradict, actually enhance each other. And yet, in this very celebration of parenthood lies its danger, because the very love of children could lead to possessiveness, to our seeing our children as ours, as belonging to us. But if God, as we stress on Rosh Hashanah, truly is our Creator and our King, then our children are not ours, and our possessiveness for our lives and for our children can lead to our rejection of one of the central premises of the penitential season, which is the renouncing of absolute ownership over anything in our lives. Haneshama lach v'haguf shalach, Jews say in one of the penitential prayers. The body is yours and the soul is yours. From a Jewish perspective, our lives are not ours, and our liturgy emphasizes that this realization is the essence of repentance. And if we tend to see ourselves as the possessors of our own lives when they really belong to God, then this is even more true about our claims over lives that are more precious to us than our own, our children's. On one episode of The Simpsons, Homer Simpson, who was upset about something, decides to take out his anger on his kids, and his wife criticizes him and says, just because you're frustrated doesn't mean you can take it out on your children. And Homer Simpson says to his wife, he says, why not? I own them. And his wife says, well, how can you say that? And Homer says, fine, we own them. But in truth, our children belong to God, just as everything else does. Thus, on Rosh Hashanah, we read of Hannah giving birth to a child, a miraculous child, and naming him Samuel, Shemuel, because she says in Hebrew, Me Hashem sha'altiv. This is often translated as, I asked God for him. But the proper translation is more probably, because I borrowed him from God. That is what Samuel means. Because I borrowed him from God. Meaning Hannah recognizes that children are not ours. They are loaned by their true owner. We are their custodians, their guardians on behalf of the divine. But we do not own them. And that is precisely why, after celebrating the birth of children, after marking on the first day of Rosh Hashanah our capacity to imitate God as Creator by becoming parents, we follow this tale with another reading on the second day of Rosh Hashanah. And that, of course, is the one known as the Akedah. Few scriptural stories are as disturbing as that known as the binding and sacrifice of Isaac, or as we call it in traditional Judaism, Akedat Yitzchak. Akedah meaning the binding. Anyone who has studied that story continues to be haunted by the Bible's words. Take now thy son, thy only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains, which I will tell thee of. And this story's themes dominates the Rosh Hashanah liturgy as well. According to our prayer books, one of the biblical names for Rosh Hashanah, Yom HaZikaron, the Day of Remembrance, makes reference to God as the Zocher HaBrit, the God who recalls the promises made to Abraham, specifically after the Akedah. And as Jewish history went on, the preferred shofar for the synagogue was not merely an animal horn, but a ram's horn, a reminder of the twisted appendage of the ram that, caught in the thicket, served as a sacrificial replacement of the son restored to his father. Every Sephardic Jew, and almost no Ashkenazic Jew, knows of Eight Sha'arei Ratzon, a 12th century liturgical poem by Judah ben Samuel ibn Abbas, which is sung immediately prior to the blowing of the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. Throughout the centuries, the haunting lyrics of Eight Sha'arei Ratzon became the Sephardic version of Unetana Tokef, and it is a description of the Akedah, and it is, for all Sephardic Jews, the poetic prayer without which marking of the new year is impossible to imagine. And just as the first theme of Rosh Hashanah, creation, is enhanced by the second theme, which is the birth of children, so too the second theme is enhanced by the third, the Akedah. Because the extraordinary claim made by Judaism is that only through the lens of this terribly frightening tale can we understand all that parenthood calls us to be. Some years ago, on a Friday morning in London, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks took Penelope Leach, one of Britain's most prominent child psychologists, to visit a Jewish primary school. There she witnessed children play-acting the rituals of the Shabbat meal that was to take place that evening. Young boys blessed the wine, little girls kindled candles, Sabbath songs were sung. Leach was struck by all she saw, but one moment was particularly enthralling. The reenactment of a tradition in many Jewish homes, where before the Sabbath meal begins, the father extends his hands to cover the heads of each of his children, and he blesses them. Leach marveled as she witnessed a 5-year-old mother and father blessing 5-year-old children with the 5-year-old grandparents looking on. And she left overcome by the centrality of family life to traditional Judaism. The ritual of Jewish parents blessing their children is indeed moving, but it is easily misconstrued. Rightly understood, it stresses first and foremost not the bond between parent and child, but rather between the child and God. The standard form of showing love to our children is through an embrace. The act is possessive in nature. We draw them close to us. To bless our children by extending our hands is the opposite. Rather than draw them close, we set them apart, indicating that they belong to someone other than ourselves. In the Bible, the one ritual comparable to the Jewish act of blessing is sacrificial in context. As Leviticus informs us, the worshiper in the temple placed his hands on the animal's head before the ritual occurred, thereby renouncing his own claim to the offering and dedicating it to God. And he shall place his hands on the head of the burnt offering, and it shall be accepted as an atonement for him. In a similar sense, to place one's hand on a child is to recall the temple and consecrate him or her to divine service. The Akedah, so haunting to all of us, is actually recreated every Friday evening in many Jewish homes all over the world, where parents place their hands on their children's heads, as their ancestors did over offerings in Jerusalem, placing the reenactment of one of the most petrifying tales about parent and child at the heart of their most sacred familial experiences. The point was made by Rabbi Soloveitchik in an extraordinary correspondence with a Catholic priest from Boston in the 1950s. At the heart of the religious worldview, he wrote to this priest, is the absolute ownership of the divine, or as he put it, man is merely a guardian in whose care the works of God have been placed as a precious charge. This, he added, is especially true of that which we are most possessive. Children, he wrote, are the greatest and most precious charge God has entrusted to man's custody. But the irrevocable, though bitter truth, he added, is that they are not ours. The Akedah, he continued, must be understood in this context. For Abraham to deserve fatherhood, he had to prove his acceptance of this theological truth and acknowledge that he was merely a custodian of the child for whom he had longed. God's intended result at the Akedah was not Isaac's death, but Abraham's recognition of the true nature of parenthood. And that is precisely, he wrote, what is recognized by Jewish parents throughout the generations. Or, as he put it, the Jewish father must always remain aware that it was only through God's infinite grace that this infant was returned to him in sacred trust. For many modern Jews, the story of the Akedah is an embarrassing anachronism, and the Levitical descriptions of animal sacrifice are seen as utterly irrelevant to our lives. The haunting possibility, however, is that these passages are painfully relevant. As Leon Kass has noted, all fathers devote or sacrifice their sons to some god or other, to Mammon or Moloch, to honor or money, pleasure or power, or worse, to no God at all. It is true, Kass concedes, that they do so less visibly and less concentratedly, but they do so willy-nilly through the things they teach and respect in their homes. They intend that the entire life of the sons be spent in service to their own ideals or idols, and in this sense they do indeed spend the life of the children. True fathers, however, by devoting their sons to only the godly ways, must be willing, quote, to part with his son as his son, recognizing him as was Isaac and as are indeed all children, as a gift and a blessing from God. Judaism then, in general, but especially on Rosh Hashanah, emphasizes the cherishing of children, but also the recognition that parenthood is a duty, not a right, that it is an act of sacred custodianship. And it is thus this last theme of Rosh Hashanah that emerges as so relevant to our own time. More than any other, ours is an age that has lavished love on children. They are coddled and protected and denied nothing. Yet, as Sedner Ben Sass has noted in his recent book about American childhood and adulthood, this has produced a generation of Americans locked in perpetual adolescence, a result of the creature comforts to which our children are accustomed, our reluctance to expose young people to the demands of real work, and the hostage-taking hold that computers and mobile devices have on adolescent attention. It is possible, and Rosh Hashanah raises the possibility for all of us, that what we need today is less embracing and more blessing, less parental possession and more parental consecration. We must consider, in other words, whether our children are merely extensions of ourselves or whether they were given to us in sacred trust. Every parent would prefer to ignore the Akedah story. And yet, especially today, the Akedah, through the shofar and through the liturgy of Rosh Hashanah, continues to call out to us. These, then, are three of the central themes of this day. First, God is our King and our Creator. Second, it is in imitation of divine creation that we bring children into this world. And third, these children, though created by us, are not owned by us. We are their custodians, and our most important role is to raise them to moral, Jewishly observant adulthood so that they, in turn, can, as Abraham did millennia ago, come to comprehend God as Creator and then partner themselves with God the Creator in becoming creators of families of their own. And rightly understood, it is the combination of all three of these themes that is the secret to Jewish endurance and eternity. Most nations celebrated their monarchs throughout their history for their power. And with the loss of that power came the end of that nation. Other people celebrated their rulers' magnificence, that it was the ceremonies that set them apart. Or as Henry V in Shakespeare tells us, what have kings that privates have not too, save ceremony, save general ceremony. And it was the loss of wealth and magnificence that these nations also disappeared as well. Jews, however, in an extraordinary interpretation of imitatio Dei, of what it means to imitate God as King, emphasizes that we are most like God when we create universes of our own. But then stressed as well that it is that universe that we do create, those children we bring into the world, that we, in an act of sacred custodianship, raise to thoughtful Jewish adulthood. And it is this, through generations of powerlessness, that ended up ensuring the very eternity of the Jewish people. Several years ago, the synagogue in which I was working at the time suffered a terrible fire. And it was at first not clear where Rosh Hashanah services would be held. Through an extraordinary act of kindness, we were invited to convene the High Holy Day congregation in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I was offered the opportunity to lead Rosh Hashanah in the auditorium at the Met. I was a little disappointed because I was hoping to oversee the sacrificial service in the Temple of Dender, but this was an interesting opportunity as well. But having experienced up to that point, every Rosh Hashanah service of my life in a synagogue, I thought that it would be odd. But duty calls, and this was the business that I had chosen. I had a job to do. And so I put on at the time my kittel, a white robe worn by the rabbis on Rosh Hashanah, put on my talit, my prayer shawl, and walked wearing both of these down Fifth Avenue and walked straight into the Met as a long line of New Yorkers were just waiting to get in at the exhibits. Of course, they paid absolutely no attention to me. I was maybe the 10th least weird person that they saw entering the building on that day. As soon as I entered the lobby, I encountered an enormous, new, but also old, visitor to the Met. It was a 10-foot tall, ancient statue of a pharaoh, Amenhotep II, which had been lent to the Met just 1 month before. And the New York Times, in a glowing review of this new statue, pronounced it the very essence of regal manhood. This may have been how the Times saw it. I, on the other hand, standing there on Rosh Hashanah, looking at the statue, could think of nothing other than of Shelley's famous poem Ozymandias, of the statue of a cruel tyrant overseeing an ancient empire. And, of course, the poem's conclusion. Nothing beside remains round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare. The lone and level sands stretch far away. And then I walked from that statue through several exhibits on my way to the auditorium. And as I walked, I passed exhibit after exhibit of ancient king after ancient king, of nation after nation, that once bestrode the world like a colossus, only to be ultimately relegated to the ash heap of history. And then walked in to the auditorium to proclaim God, the Melech Elyon, the heavenly eternal King, and to recite the liturgy that Jews have proclaimed for generation after generation. I experienced, as it were, what the Southern writer Walker Percy once reflected when he wrote, "Why does no one find it remarkable that in most world cities today there are Jews, but not one single Hittite, even though the Hittites had a great flourishing civilization, while the Jews nearby were a weak and obscure people? When one meets a Jew in New York or New Orleans or Paris or Melbourne," he writes, "it is remarkable that no one considers the event remarkable. What are they doing here? But it is even more remarkable to wonder," he added, "if there are Jews here, why are there no Hittites here? Where are the Hittites? Show me one Hittite in New York City." End quote. Empire after empire, gone. Melech Evyon after Melech Evyon, human king after human king. And then Rosh Hashanah, celebrated with a people that year after year coronated the one true king and taught themselves that the one way to imitate his majesty and his glory was to bring families into the world and act as the very stewards of God on his behalf in bringing these children into the world. It was, without question, one of the most meaningful Rosh Hashanahs of my life, when all the themes of the liturgy suddenly became all the more real and all the more meaningful to me. One of the greatest holidays that I've experienced. And that is what I wish this year for all of you. Thank you very much. I'm Meir Soloveichik. If you enjoyed this lecture, please be sure to sign up for future updates and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you for watching.